They served sizzling steak to everyone at the table. Expensive wine. Warm laughter. Then my daughter-in-law slid a plate in front of me, cold leftovers, gray at the edges, like scraps meant for a stranger. Nobody looked up. Nobody cared. But at 5:42 the next morning, someone tried to quietly drain money from my investment account, and they had no idea I was already sitting inside the bank, freezing every card tied to their perfect little lives. And what happened next, no one saw coming. The steaks arrived still sizzling, filling the dining room with the rich smell of butter, rosemary, and expensive wine. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath the pendant lights stretching above the long glass table, and conversations rolled easily around me, polished and effortless, like everyone in that Santa Monica house already knew exactly where they belonged. Everyone except me. Vanessa moved gracefully between the guests in her cream silk dress, smiling too brightly, touching shoulders lightly, laughing at stories she barely listened to. "Medium rare for Jason," she said warmly as she placed another perfect steak onto a porcelain plate. "And extra sauce for Melissa." Then she reached my side of the table. Her smile faded almost invisibly. "Oh," she murmured, as if she had nearly forgotten I was there. "This one's for you, Margaret." She lowered a smaller plate in front of me. One thin piece of meat. Cold. Gray around the edges. Not freshly cooked like the others. Leftovers. Reheated badly enough that even the sauce had separated into oily streaks across the porcelain. For a second, nobody reacted. Not Ethan. Not the guests. Not even the waiter refilling glasses nearby. My chair had already told me the truth before the food did. It had been added after the table was arranged, squeezed awkwardly near the far corner with no matching napkin, no wine glass, barely enough room for my elbows. Someone had remembered me at the last minute. Or worse. Remembered me intentionally. I lifted my fork slowly. Across the table, Ethan laughed loudly at something one of his business partners said, leaning back with the easy confidence of a man who had spent years building a life everyone admired. That laugh used to sound different when he was younger. Softer. Real. Now it sounded practiced. Vanessa finally glanced at my plate and gave a small shrug. "The kitchen ran out of steaks faster than expected," she said lightly. "I figured leftovers were fine." Fine. The word settled over the table like dust. I nodded once. Of course. What else was there to say? A woman learns many things by 73. One of them is this: the cruelest humiliations almost never arrive screaming. They arrive smiling. Quiet. Polite enough that everyone else can pretend nothing happened. Beside me, Chloe looked up from her plate. Her eyes moved from my food to everyone else's. Confusion flickered across her face. "Grandma doesn't have," Vanessa touched her daughter's shoulder immediately. "Finish your dinner, sweetheart." The correction came softly, but Chloe lowered her eyes at once. Even children learn quickly which truths are unwelcome in certain homes. Conversation resumed. Someone talked about Napa vineyards. Someone else mentioned private schools. Renovations. Vacation properties. Numbers floated casually through the air, tens of thousands spoken as lightly as weather updates, and with every sentence, I could hear my own invisible fingerprints all over their lives. The down payment for this house. The tuition. The emergency loans Ethan promised he would repay once things stabilized. They never stabilized. They simply became permanent. I cut into the cold meat carefully. It resisted the knife harder than it should have. Across the table, crystal glasses clinked together while steam still rose from everyone else's plates. Nobody looked at me long enough to feel guilty. That hurt more than the leftovers. Dessert arrived nearly an hour later. A glossy chocolate tart decorated with gold flakes. Vanessa served every guest personally before sliding the smallest slice onto a plate beside my untouched water glass. Again, no eye contact. Again, no apology. By the time dinner finally ended, my chest felt strangely hollow, as if something inside me had gone quiet without permission. Ethan walked me to the front door while checking messages on his phone. "Drive safe, Mom," he muttered distractedly. "I always do." He nodded without really hearing me. Outside, the cool Santa Monica air brushed against my skin as I stepped toward my old sedan parked near the curb. Behind me, laughter still spilled through the glowing windows of the house. Warm light. Beautiful home. Perfect family. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the glass walls of the mansion I had helped pay for. And somewhere deep inside me, a painful question finally rose clearly enough that I could no longer push it away. When did I become a guest in the very family I built? I tightened my hands around my purse and looked back one last time at the bright dining room where nobody had noticed my silence. Maybe tonight, something had finally died inside me. And if you have ever sat in a room full of people yet still felt completely invisible, stay with me until the end of this story. Because sometimes the moment that changes your life forever does not begin with violence. Sometimes it begins with a cold plate placed quietly in front of you. The drive home felt longer than usual. Santa Monica's streets glowed under pale streetlights, quiet and polished, as if the entire city had agreed to pretend nothing ugly ever happened inside beautiful houses. I kept both hands on the steering wheel, but my mind stayed trapped at that dinner table, staring at the cold slice of meat Vanessa had placed in front of me like an afterthought. By the time I stepped into my house, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. Not physical exhaustion. The older kind. The kind that builds slowly over years of giving pieces of yourself away until you barely recognize what remains. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and turned on the small lamp above the sink. Warm yellow light spilled across stacks of unopened mail, grocery coupons, and the old budgeting notebook I still used out of habit. Some people stop tracking numbers after retirement. I never did. Numbers made me feel safe. People rarely did. The kettle began to hum softly while I opened the drawer beneath the counter and pulled out a thick folder worn at the corners. Receipts. Mortgage records. Tuition payments. Insurance transfers. Years of paperwork bundled together by rubber bands that had started drying with age. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. The same table where I had once spent entire nights calculating payroll reports after Charles died. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice again. "Don't stay up too late, Maggie." God, I missed the way he said my name. After Charles passed, Ethan unraveled fast. Faster than he ever admitted publicly. One failed business idea turned into credit card debt. Debt became overdue rent. Overdue rent became panic hidden behind expensive suits and confident smiles. "Mom, I just need a little help getting back on my feet. That was the first time. A little help became another transfer 3 months later. Then another. Then came the startup. Ethan had walked into my living room carrying presentation folders and speaking with the nervous excitement of a man desperate to believe his own promises. "This one's different," he told me. "I know it's going to work." I wanted to believe him. Maybe because mothers are trained to hear hope even when reality sounds louder. So I emptied part of my retirement savings to help him launch the company. When that money disappeared, I paid off the business loan before creditors could sue him. When the mortgage on the Santa Monica house became too expensive, I quietly covered 6 months of payments temporarily. Temporary lasted 4 years. I helped pay Chloe's private school tuition because Ethan insisted the public schools nearby were too limiting. Then came the nanny. Vanessa sat across from me one afternoon holding a green smoothie in one hand while barely looking up from her phone. "I just can't manage everything alone," she sighed dramatically. "Ethan's constantly working. The nanny cost more per month than my first apartment after marriage. I paid for her too." Later, when Ethan's car lease collapsed under missed payments, he showed up at my house embarrassed and restless. "I hate asking again, Mom." But he still asked. And I still said yes. Because every crisis came wrapped in the same invisible thread: family, love, responsibility. That was how it always worked. Nobody demanded outright. They leaned. Slowly. Repeatedly. Until supporting them became your permanent position in life. I reached deeper into the folder and found an old receipt from 10 years earlier. Ethan's handwriting stretched across the top corner. "Thank you. I'll pay you back." I stared at those words for a long time. Not because of the money. Because of how sincerely I once believed them. Outside, headlights briefly swept across my kitchen window before disappearing down the street. The kettle clicked off behind me, but I didn't move immediately. Instead, I sat there surrounded by old receipts and fading promises, asking myself a question I should have asked years earlier. Can loving someone too much slowly teach them to use you? My chest tightened. Because somewhere along the way, helping Ethan stand back up had quietly turned into carrying his entire life on my shoulders. And the worst part? I hadn't noticed when he stopped standing on his own. I thought I was saving my son. Until I realized he had grown comfortable standing on top of me instead. The strange thing about cruelty is how small it can look from the outside. Nobody at that dinner table insulted me directly. Vanessa never raised her voice. Ethan never told me to leave. If someone had walked into that beautiful Santa Monica dining room halfway through the evening, they probably would have seen a successful family sharing wine and dessert beneath warm lighting. They would have missed the details. The untouched wine glass in front of me while everyone else received refills without asking. The way Vanessa leaned across me to serve another guest, her perfume brushing past my shoulder as if I were part of the furniture. The absence of a single question. Not one. Not how have you been? Not did you sleep well? Not even polite concern disguised as conversation. I sat there through nearly 3 hours of dinner, and nobody asked me anything personal once. At some point, Ethan began telling a story about a business retreat in Napa. Everyone laughed while he described private wine tastings and luxury suites overlooking the vineyards. You should have seen the bathroom alone, Vanessa added with a bright laugh. It was bigger than our first apartment. Our first apartment. I almost smiled at that. I remembered the apartment very clearly because I had paid the security deposit myself after Ethan maxed out his credit cards at 26. But I said nothing. Again. That had become my role in their lives. Quiet support. Silent funding. Invisible presence. Across the table, Chloe kept glancing at me between bites of dessert. The poor girl was trying not to make it obvious. Every time Vanessa noticed, her expression tightened slightly. Not angry. Worse. Corrective. As if empathy itself were inappropriate. Dessert arrived on long white plates decorated with gold flakes and raspberries arranged like artwork. Vanessa placed generous slices in front of every guest before finally stopping beside me. "Oh," she said softly, looking down at the tray. "I guess this is the last piece." The slice she placed on my plate was nearly half the size of everyone else's. Thin. Uneven. Almost embarrassing. For one dangerous second, silence hovered around the table. Chloe looked directly at her mother. "Why does Grandma always get less?" The question landed harder than any accusation. Vanessa's smile froze instantly. "Chloe," she said quietly, "don't be rude." "I wasn't trying to, honey." Ethan finally looked up from his phone. "Eat your dessert." The girl lowered her eyes at once, but not before I caught the confusion on her face. Children notice unfairness long before adults stop pretending it exists. I picked up my fork slowly. The tart tasted rich and expensive, but humiliation has a way of making sweetness disappear. By the end of the evening, my untouched wine glass still stood beside my plate like evidence no one cared enough to remove. When I finally rose to leave, Vanessa gave me a quick air kiss near the cheek. "Drive safe, Margaret." Not Mom. Not even warmly. Just Margaret. Polite. Distant. Conveniently formal for a woman living partly on my money. Outside, the ocean air felt colder than before. I walked toward my car carefully, hearing laughter continue behind me through the glowing windows of the house. Nobody followed. Nobody noticed how quickly I left. Inside the silence of my sedan, I sat motionless for several seconds with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Something about tonight felt different. Not louder. Clearer. As if years of tiny humiliations had finally aligned into one undeniable truth. When I arrived home, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't make tea. Instead, I walked directly to the cabinet beside the kitchen and pulled out the thick financial binder I had spent years avoiding for reasons I could no longer explain. The house felt unusually still after midnight. Not lonely. Exhausted. As if the walls themselves had spent years absorbing tension without ever being allowed to release it. Margaret filled the kettle and stood quietly beside the sink while water rushed against metal. Outside the kitchen window, faint streetlights stretched across the sleeping neighborhood, pale and distant. Somewhere far away, a siren echoed briefly through Santa Monica before disappearing again. The kettle began to hum. Soft. Steady. Predictable. Unlike people. She carried her tea carefully to the kitchen table and opened the thick financial binder waiting beside the lamp. The cover had faded slightly over the years from constant handling. Inside were stacks of papers organized with painful precision. Mortgage statements, tuition invoices, insurance transfers, emergency wire confirmations. Entire years of her life flattened into paperwork. Margaret adjusted her glasses and slowly turned another page. Ethan's name appeared over and over again in different forms, different amounts, different crises. March 2014, overdue rent assistance. September 2016, startup recovery loan. January 2018, mortgage payment extension. April 2020, private school tuition transfer. The numbers blurred together after a while. But the pattern never changed. Each payment had arrived wrapped inside urgency. Mom, I swear this is temporary. I just need breathing room. You know I'd do the same for you. That last sentence almost made her laugh now. Almost. Steam drifted upward from the untouched tea beside her, curling beneath the yellow kitchen light. Margaret leaned back slowly in her chair and pressed tired fingers against her temple. When had helping stopped feeling generous? When had it started feeling expected? That question sat heavily inside her chest. Because the truth was uncomfortable. Nobody had forced her into this role. Not directly. Ethan never screamed at her for money. Vanessa never openly demanded support. The manipulation had been quieter than that. More patient. A disappointed sigh. A worried phone call late at night. A grandchild's tuition mentioned at exactly the right moment. Every conversation carried the same invisible pressure: if you love us, you'll help. And Margaret always had. Not because she was weak. Because after Charles died, taking care of Ethan became the only purpose that still made her feel necessary. She lowered her eyes toward the binder again. One old receipt slipped slightly loose from the stack. Her own handwriting stared back at her from the corner of the page. Transfer completed immediately. The date beneath it was from the week Ethan and Vanessa bought the Santa Monica house. Margaret remembered standing inside that empty property years ago while Ethan walked excitedly from room to room. "We're finally building something real, Mom." At the time, pride had drowned out caution. Now, sitting alone beneath the dim kitchen light, she understood something much harder to admit. Somewhere along the way, her love had quietly trained everyone around her to believe her sacrifices were permanent. Her tea had gone cold before she even noticed. Margaret wrapped both hands around the cup anyway, searching for warmth that no longer lived there. And deep inside, another question rose slowly to the surface. Why did thinking about herself always feel like betrayal? Margaret should have closed the binder right there. Most people would have. The night was already heavy enough. Her tea had gone cold. Her eyes ached from reading old numbers tied to old mistakes. But something inside her kept pushing forward, quiet and restless, like instinct trying to speak before fear could silence it again. She turned another page. Then another. A loose document slipped from the back pocket of the binder and drifted onto the table beside her cup. At first, it looked unimportant. Just a printed email. No signature. No highlight marks. But Ethan's name sat clearly at the top of the page. Margaret frowned slightly and adjusted her glasses. The message had been sent 2 weeks earlier to a financial advisor connected to one of her investment accounts. Her heartbeat slowed. Not sped up. Slowed. The way the body reacts when shock becomes too sharp to process all at once. The email was brief. Professional. Careful. Hello, I'd like information regarding converting my mother's investment portfolio into a joint access structure for future financial management planning. Margaret read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Joint access. Her fingers tightened around the paper. No conversation had ever happened about this. No discussion. No warning. No, Mom, what do you think? Nothing. Only quiet planning behind her back. The room suddenly felt colder than before. Margaret kept reading. Ethan had asked about authorization procedures, withdrawal flexibility, secondary user permissions, and timeline requirements. The language was polished enough to sound responsible to a stranger. But she knew her son too well. Ethan only became this organized when money was involved. A memory surfaced instantly. 3 months earlier, Vanessa had casually asked during brunch, "Have you ever thought about simplifying your accounts now that you're older?" At the time, Margaret barely noticed the question. Now it returned with teeth. Another moment followed behind it. Ethan insisting she keep everything centralized. Vanessa suggesting automatic access in case of emergencies. None of it had felt dangerous separately. Together, it formed something else entirely. A plan. Margaret slowly lowered the paper onto the table. The kitchen clock ticked softly in the silence. 11:47 p.m. For years she had convinced herself that the dependency was emotional. Temporary. Messy, maybe, but still rooted in love. This felt different. This felt administrative. Calculated. As if her existence had quietly shifted categories in their minds. Not mother. Not family. Asset. The words slid into her thoughts so clearly it made her stomach tighten. She stood abruptly and walked toward the sink, pressing one trembling hand against the counter while trying to steady her breathing. No, she whispered under her breath, though she no longer knew whether she was denying the email or denying the truth behind it. Outside, wind brushed softly against the windows. Inside, something much colder settled over her. Because the most painful realization was not that Ethan wanted access to her accounts. It was that he never intended to ask permission first. Margaret stared down at her reflection in the dark kitchen window. When had her sacrifices stopped being gifts? When had they become assumptions? And deeper than that. If your own child begins calculating your life like an asset waiting to be managed, when exactly does love die? Tears threatened briefly behind her eyes, but they never fell. This pain was too old for dramatic breakdowns. Too familiar. Instead, a strange calm began forming beneath the shock. Not forgiveness. Not rage. Clarity. Margaret returned slowly to the kitchen table and looked once more at the printed email lying beneath the lamplight. Then her eyes shifted toward the digital clock glowing quietly across the room. 11:52 p.m. She stared at the numbers for several long seconds. And for the first time in years, a decision arrived inside her without guilt attached to it. Tomorrow, she was going to end this. Margaret barely slept. Not because she was emotional. Because clarity had finally arrived, and clarity is louder than fear. By 5:15 in the morning, she was already dressed. Dark wool coat. Low heels. Hair pinned neatly into place with the same discipline she had carried through decades of surviving difficult things quietly. Outside, Santa Monica still belonged to the night. The streets were pale and empty beneath the fading glow of streetlights. A cold layer of ocean mist hovered low over the sidewalks while Margaret drove toward downtown, both hands steady on the wheel. No music. No radio. Only the soft hum of the engine and the sentence repeating in her mind over and over again, "Tomorrow. I'm going to end this." Except tomorrow had already arrived. The bank opened at 6 for private clients. Margaret parked nearly 20 minutes early and remained inside the car for a moment, staring through the glass front entrance while dawn slowly began to brighten the sky behind it. A strange calm settled over her chest. Not peace. Preparation. Inside, the office smelled faintly of polished floors, printer toner, and over-conditioned air. Everything looked cold. Organized. Controlled. Margaret found comfort in that immediately. Numbers obey rules. People invent loopholes. A young receptionist greeted her politely before guiding her toward a private office near the back. Angela Rivera stood as Margaret entered. She looked to be in her 40s. Sharp eyes. Crisp navy blazer. The kind of woman who noticed details professionally. "Mrs. Sullivan," Angela said warmly, extending her hand. "You sounded concerned on the phone." Margaret sat carefully across from her desk and placed the thick binder down between them. "I need to make immediate changes to every account connected to my family." Angela's expression shifted almost instantly. Professional concern replacing friendliness. "What kind of changes?" Margaret inhaled slowly. "I want all automatic transfers frozen." Angela nodded once and opened her laptop. "All shared credit cards canceled." More typing. "Any secondary access permissions removed." The clicking of keys filled the office. "And I want new security verification added to every investment account I own." This time Angela paused briefly before continuing. "Of course," she said carefully. "May I ask if someone has compromised your accounts?" Margaret hesitated. Then answered honestly. "I think someone was preparing to." Silence stretched between them for a second too long. Angela turned her screen slightly and began reviewing recent account activity. Morning sunlight slowly pushed through the tall glass windows behind her, casting pale gold across the office walls. Then Angela stopped typing. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Mrs. Sullivan," something in her tone made Margaret's stomach tighten instantly. Angela clicked twice more before turning the monitor fully toward her. "There was a login attempt on your investment portfolio this morning at 5:42 a.m. Margaret felt her pulse drop heavily inside her chest. She had been driving to the bank at that exact time. Angela continued quietly. The user entered correct identification details but failed secondary verification. Margaret stared at the screen. Not breathing. Not blinking. Angela's voice lowered further. "There's more." Another click. A preliminary withdrawal request was initiated immediately after the login. The room seemed to lose temperature all at once. How much? Margaret asked softly. Large enough to matter, Angela replied. Small enough not to trigger emergency fraud review. A test. Not desperation. Not panic. Strategy. Margaret suddenly understood everything with terrifying clarity. This wasn't about helping her manage finances. This was about access. Control. Preparation. Her hands folded tightly together in her lap to stop the shaking. Outside the office windows, sunlight finally broke through the gray morning mist. Inside, the keyboard clicking resumed as Angela began locking down account after account. Margaret listened quietly while signatures printed one after another. Freeze authorization. Card termination. Access revocation. Every form felt less like paperwork and more like reclaiming ownership over her own life. Because the most dangerous woman in the world is not the one with power. It's the one who no longer fears losing anyone. At last, Angela removed her glasses and studied Margaret carefully across the desk. Mrs. Sullivan, she said gently, are you absolutely certain you want to do this to your son? Margaret looked down at the final document waiting for her signature. Then she picked up the pen. Margaret signed the final document slowly while the morning light spread across Angela's office, and for the first time in years, her hands did not tremble from guilt. They trembled from truth. Because sometimes betrayal does not arrive in one violent moment. It builds quietly through favors, sacrifices, and the dangerous habit of always saying yes. And if you are starting to realize that someone in your life treats your kindness like an obligation instead of a gift, stay with this story. Because the most terrifying part is not the betrayal itself. It is discovering it has been happening for years. Margaret returned home just after 8 in the morning. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Palm trees swayed lazily in the coastal breeze. A gardener trimmed hedges 2 houses down. Somewhere nearby, sprinklers clicked rhythmically across expensive green lawns. Nothing outside had changed. But inside her life, something enormous had shifted. She hung her coat carefully near the door and walked straight into the kitchen. The silence waiting there felt unfamiliar at first. Not empty. Protective. Margaret filled the kettle again and stood quietly while water heated. Her phone rested face down on the counter beside her purse. Still silent. For now. At exactly 8:17, the first vibration came. A sharp buzz against the marble countertop. Then another. Then 3 more in rapid succession. Margaret didn't reach for it immediately. She already knew. Somewhere across Los Angeles, a card had just failed. She poured hot water slowly into her teacup while the phone continued rattling against the counter like something trapped and desperate. Finally, she turned the screen over. Ethan calling. The name flashed again almost instantly after it stopped. And again. By the 4th attempt, a text message appeared. Mom, call me now. A second message arrived before she even finished reading the first. My corporate card just got declined during a client lunch. What's happening? Margaret stared at the screen quietly. No, are you okay? No concern. Only interruption. Only inconvenience. Another buzz exploded across the counter. Vanessa. What did you do? Margaret exhaled slowly and carried her tea into the living room instead of answering. Outside the large front window, sunlight spread softly across the street while panic traveled through her family like fire. At 9:02, Ethan called again. At 9:11, another message. The mortgage payment bounced. At 9:26, the school says Chloe's tuition account is frozen. At 9:31, Mom, this is serious. Then Vanessa joined in again. Her messages arrived longer. Sharper. My card was declined in front of everyone at the spa. Do you understand how humiliating that was? People were staring at me. Fix this immediately. Margaret lowered the phone slowly into her lap. Humiliating. That word stayed with her. Not cruel. Not unfair. Not, why didn't you tell us you were hurting? Humiliating. Because that was the part they feared most. Exposure. For years, they had accepted her money quietly because quiet dependency still allowed them to feel successful. But public embarrassment? That threatened the image they built their entire lives around. Margaret took another sip of tea. Warm. Steady. Nothing like the chaos unraveling on the other side of the city. She pictured Ethan sitting inside some polished conference room, pretending to stay calm while his payment failed in front of colleagues. Vanessa standing frozen at the front desk of her luxury spa, hearing the receptionist say politely, "I'm sorry, ma'am, this card has been declined." For the first time in years, Margaret saw the truth clearly enough to stop defending them inside her own mind. They were never truly afraid of hurting her. They were afraid of losing access to the life she paid for. The phone buzzed again. 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 Margaret silenced it completely this time and set it face down beside her untouched tea. Then she leaned back against the couch and closed her eyes briefly while the house settled into stillness around her. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond those peaceful walls, Ethan and Vanessa were beginning to discover what panic feels like when the person holding everything together quietly lets go. By early afternoon, the house had finally gone quiet again. Not because the panic had stopped. Because Margaret had stopped answering it. Her phone now rested face down beside the sink, silenced completely after nearly 4 straight hours of calls, messages, and demands disguised as emergencies. The kettle had cooled. Half her tea sat untouched near the window while sunlight stretched slowly across the kitchen floor. For the first time all morning, she could hear herself think. Then the screen lit up again. Softly this time. Not Ethan. Not Vanessa. Chloe. Margaret felt something inside her loosen before she even opened the message. "Grandma, are you okay?" That was all. No accusation. No panic. No mention of money. Just concern. Real concern. Margaret stared at the words longer than she expected to. The brightness from the phone reflected faintly against her glasses while the quiet kitchen seemed to hold its breath around her. Finally, she typed back. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Are you?" 3 small dots appeared almost immediately. Then vanished. Then returned again. The hesitation hurt more than any angry message had. "I think so. Mom and Dad are yelling a lot." Another pause. Then, Dad said the bank messed something up. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Of course he did. Because accepting betrayal would require accountability, and accountability was something Ethan had spent years avoiding elegantly. A second message appeared. I didn't like how they talked about you last night. That one landed deeper. Margaret lowered the phone slowly into her lap, her chest tightening with a sadness too old to become dramatic. Across the room, the kitchen clock ticked softly while distant traffic moved somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Children notice everything, she thought. Especially the things adults work hardest to hide. For years, Chloe had watched the small moments nobody else acknowledged. The untouched wine glass. The smaller dessert plate. The way Vanessa's smile changed whenever Margaret entered a room. Kids always see the tension first because they still recognize honesty before comfort teaches them to ignore it. Margaret picked the phone back up carefully. Thank you for checking on me, sweetheart. Another quick reply came seconds later. I love you, Grandma. Red heart. The tiny heart emoji glowing on the screen nearly broke something inside her. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was sincere. Margaret pressed trembling fingers lightly against her mouth while emotion rose unexpectedly into her throat. After an entire morning of demands, manipulation, and entitlement, one simple message from a 16-year-old girl suddenly felt like oxygen entering a room that had been suffocating for years. And quietly, painfully, another question moved through her mind. Do children always recognize the truth long before adults finally admit it? The piece lasted less than an hour. At 2:43 p.m., Margaret heard tires scrape sharply against the curb outside her house. Not one car. Two. She didn't need to look through the window to know who it was. The energy arrived before the people did. Fast. Angry. Entitled. A car door slammed hard enough to rattle the glass in the kitchen cabinets. Then another. Voices followed immediately after, tense and overlapping. What do you mean she's not answering? She's doing this on purpose, Ethan. Margaret remained seated at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped calmly around her tea while the afternoon light drifted softly across the curtains. The phone beside her buzzed again. Ethan calling. Ignored. Another vibration. Vanessa calling. Ignored too. Outside, footsteps moved quickly up the walkway. Then came the pounding. 3 hard knocks against the front door. Mom. Ethan's voice cracked through the house. Open the door. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Not because she was afraid. Because she recognized the tone. That wasn't concern. It was loss of control. Another bang rattled the frame. Margaret. Vanessa snapped this time. This has gone far enough. Interesting, Margaret thought quietly. For years they ignored her discomfort easily. But one day without access to her money suddenly became an emergency. The curtain near the living room window shifted gently in the breeze from the air vent. Margaret glanced toward it carefully and could just make out their silhouettes through the fabric. Ethan pacing. Vanessa standing stiffly beside him with her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Even from inside the house, Margaret could feel the panic radiating off them. The phone buzzed again. A text message. Open this door right now. Another one arrived seconds later. The mortgage payment failed again. Then, what exactly are you trying to prove? Margaret stared at the screen without emotion. That question almost fascinated her. Because after years of being treated like a financial safety net instead of a person, they still believed this was about punishment, not protection. Outside, Ethan knocked again, louder now. "Mom, please." Vanessa cut him off sharply. "Stop begging. She's being manipulative." Margaret nearly laughed at that. Manipulative. The woman who had silently financed their lives for years was suddenly manipulative the moment she stopped. Another voice rose outside. "We could lose the house over this." There it was. Not, "We're worried about you." Not, "Why didn't we see your pain?" The house. The payments. The money. Always the money. Margaret lifted her tea slowly and took another sip while the knocking continued through the walls. And for the first time in years, something inside her shifted completely. The silence no longer felt weak. It felt powerful. Outside the front window, Ethan stepped closer to the door again. His voice dropped lower this time, roughened by frustration. "Mom, come on. Don't do this." Margaret could picture his face perfectly without even seeing it. The disbelief. The anger. The confusion that appears when someone you depended on finally stops cooperating. Vanessa's patience snapped next. "If you don't open this door right now, we're coming back with a locksmith." That finally made Margaret stand. Not quickly. Not emotionally. Calmly. She carried her cup into the living room and stopped near the front entrance, separated from them by only a few feet of wood and years of buried resentment. For one brief moment, nobody spoke. The house settled around them in heavy silence. Then Margaret answered through the door quietly enough that they had to stop moving to hear her. "No." Outside, everything froze. Even Vanessa. Ethan spoke first. "What?" "I said no." Her voice remained soft. Controlled. Almost gentle. But something about that calmness frightened them more than shouting ever could. Because for years they had mistaken her kindness for permanent access. Now the access was gone. And they had no idea how to reach her anymore. The silence stretched again. Longer this time. Finally, Ethan exhaled shakily from the other side of the door. "Mom, what happened to you?" Margaret rested one hand lightly against the wood. "Nothing happened to me," she thought. "I just finally saw you clearly." But she never said the words aloud. Instead, she stepped away from the door completely while another wave of furious whispers erupted outside. Minutes later, the car doors slammed again. The engines started. Then the street fell quiet. Margaret stood alone in the center of the living room while sunlight faded slowly across the floorboards. For the first time in years, her silence had terrified them. And by the next morning, she would make sure fear was the least of what they lost. Margaret arrived at Richard Bennett's office the next morning at exactly 9 a.m. Not early. Not late. Precise. The same way she had handled every painful responsibility in her life. Outside, downtown Santa Monica moved normally beneath the California sunlight. Coffee shops filled with quiet conversations. Expensive cars rolled through intersections. People carried shopping bags and rushed through ordinary mornings completely unaware that somewhere above them, a woman was preparing to dismantle the financial foundation of her own family. Richard stood when she entered his office. He had known Margaret for nearly 20 years. Long enough to recognize immediately that something fundamental had changed in her. "You sounded serious on the phone," he said carefully. "I am." No trembling voice. No tears. That unsettled him more. Margaret sat across from the white oak desk while sunlight spilled through the tall windows behind him, stretching across stacks of legal documents and polished wood shelves lined with old case files. Richard opened a folder slowly. "What would you like to change?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "I want to rewrite my will." The room became very still. Richard removed his glasses carefully. "All right. I want Ethan removed entirely." Even after decades as a lawyer, Richard paused for half a second at the bluntness of it. "No inheritance," Margaret continued calmly. "No property rights. No control over medical or financial decisions if something happens to me." Richard studied her face closely. "Does Ethan know you're doing this?" "No." A long silence settled between them. "Not uncomfortable." "Final." Richard nodded once and began making notes. "And Vanessa?" Margaret's expression hardened slightly for the first time all morning. "She gets nothing." The scratching of his pen continued across the paper. Outside the office windows, sunlight flashed against passing traffic far below. Then Richard looked back up. "Who do you want listed as primary beneficiary?" Margaret answered immediately. "Chloe." No hesitation there either. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair. "All assets?" "Yes." "The investment accounts?" "The house?" "The remaining retirement funds?" "Everything." But Margaret's voice softened slightly when she added, "I want the trust protected until she's 25. Richard gave a small nod of approval. Smart. Careful. Protective. The exact opposite of what Ethan had become. Margaret looked down at the unfinished legal papers spread across the desk. Crisp white pages waiting for signatures that would permanently alter the future of her family. And strangely, she felt calmer than she had in years. Not because revenge felt good. Because clarity did. For so long, she had confused sacrifice with love. She believed saving Ethan repeatedly made her a good mother. But somewhere along the way, every rescue had quietly removed another consequence from his life. No consequences. No accountability. No growth. Only dependency disguised as family loyalty. Richard finally broke the silence carefully. "Margaret, are you certain?" She lifted her eyes toward him slowly. "Do you know what the hardest part is?" she asked quietly. Richard waited. "I kept thinking love meant never letting him fall." Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the legal papers. "But maybe," she exhaled softly. "Maybe loving someone sometimes means finally stopping the fall from becoming comfortable." The words hung in the office longer than either of them expected. Richard looked at her differently after that. Not fragile. Not emotional. Resolved. He turned the final document toward her and placed a silver pen carefully beside it. "All right," he said softly. "Then let's make this official." Margaret stared at the signature line. For one brief moment, Images flashed through her mind. Ethan at 6 years old holding her hand. Ethan crying at his father's funeral. Ethan promising, "I'll take care of you someday, Mom." The ache in her chest returned instantly. But so did the memory of the cold leftovers. The unanswered concern. The secret email. The attempted access. And suddenly grief gave way to something colder. Truth. Margaret picked up the silver pen. Then she signed her name slowly across the page, knowing some decisions do not destroy a family. They simply reveal what the family had already become. Richard gathered the signed papers carefully, stacking them into neat alignment while the office settled into a heavy silence. For a moment, Margaret thought the meeting was over. Then Richard hesitated. A small pause. Barely noticeable. But after years of surviving disappointment, Margaret had learned to recognize the exact moment someone was deciding whether a truth would hurt too much to say aloud. "Margaret," Richard lowered his voice slightly. "There's something else I think you should know." Her stomach tightened instantly. Richard removed another file from his desk drawer and opened it slowly. "About 6 months ago, Ethan contacted me privately." The air in the room changed. Margaret didn't move. Didn't blink. Richard continued carefully, choosing every word with visible caution. He asked questions regarding power of attorney procedures. For a second, Margaret genuinely didn't understand what she was hearing. "Power of attorney," she repeated quietly. Richard nodded once. He wanted information about obtaining financial authority over your accounts in the event of cognitive decline or medical vulnerability. The sentence landed like ice water directly into her chest. Margaret stared at him. Not angry yet. Worse. Horrified. Because suddenly dozens of moments rearranged themselves inside her memory with terrifying clarity. Vanessa asking whether she ever forgot passwords. Ethan insisting she should simplify financial management. The subtle conversations about aging. Safety. Long-term planning. Not concern. Preparation. Richard kept speaking gently. "I told him those arrangements require explicit legal consent and medical documentation. Nothing proceeded beyond the consultation." But Margaret barely heard the last part. Her pulse roared too loudly now. This wasn't about helping her grow older safely. This was about positioning themselves around her decline before it even happened. Controlling it. Managing it. Owning it. Margaret slowly looked down at her hands resting in her lap. They were trembling now. Not from weakness. From violation. "They thought ahead," she whispered. Richard said nothing. Because there was nothing comforting left to say. The horror of betrayal changes once planning enters the picture. Desperation can sometimes be forgiven. Panic can be explained. Preparation is different. Preparation means intent. Margaret stood abruptly and walked toward the office window, pressing one hand lightly against the glass while traffic moved peacefully below. The city looked normal. People crossing sidewalks. Coffee shops opening. Sunlight everywhere. Meanwhile, her own son had quietly explored legal pathways to controlling her entire financial existence. A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "All this time," she murmured softly, almost to herself, I thought they were afraid of losing me. Richard watched her carefully. Margaret's eyes hardened slowly as the truth finally finished assembling itself inside her mind. They weren't trying to protect my old age. Her voice dropped lower. They were trying to control it. The words settled into the room like something irreversible. And at that exact moment, Margaret understood the most frightening part of all. Ethan and Vanessa never intended to stop. Not eventually. Not when things improved. Not after one more favor. Every sacrifice she made had only expanded their expectations further. And now that she had finally stepped away, they were panicking because the system they depended on was disappearing. Margaret barely made it home before they arrived again. This time, they didn't knock politely. The pounding started before she even reached the kitchen. Hard. Relentless. Angry enough to shake the picture frames near the hallway. Open the door. Vanessa shouted from outside. Right now. Margaret stood motionless for one long second, exhaustion pressing heavily behind her eyes. Richard's words still echoed inside her head. Power of attorney. Control. Preparation. By the time she unlocked the front door, her hands no longer trembled from fear. Only fury. Ethan pushed inside first the moment the door opened. His tie hung loose now, his hair disheveled, panic breaking through the polished image he usually protected so carefully. What the hell is wrong with you? He snapped. Vanessa stormed in behind him without waiting to be invited. The mortgage bounced again. And Chloe's tuition account is frozen. Ethan added immediately. Not hello. Not are you okay. Only damage control. Margaret closed the door quietly behind them. I know. Vanessa stared at her in disbelief. You know? Her voice cracked sharply upward. That's all you have to say? Margaret remained calm. Too calm. And somehow that angered them more. Ethan stepped closer. Mom, people are calling me non-stop. My accounts are getting flagged. The school threatened late penalties this morning. Margaret looked at him carefully. For the first time, she noticed how little concern existed beneath his panic. Everything on his face revolved around inconvenience. Embarrassment. Exposure. Vanessa suddenly laughed once, short, bitter, unstable. You can't just destroy our lives because you're upset over dinner. The sentence hung in the room like poison. Margaret felt something inside her go cold. So that's what you think this is about? What else would it be? Vanessa shot back instantly. You've been acting insane for 2 days. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face aggressively. Mom, just fix this. We can talk later. Fix this. Not understand. Not apologize. Fix. As if she were still the emergency system designed to stabilize every consequence they created. Margaret's voice lowered. I saw the email, Ethan. Everything stopped. A visible pause hit both of them at once. Ethan's eyes shifted first. Vanessa's expression tightened immediately after. What email? He asked too quickly. Margaret stepped closer. The one asking about joint access to my investment accounts. Silence. Pure silence. Outside, Distant traffic drifted faintly through the neighborhood while tension thickened inside the house like smoke. Ethan finally exhaled sharply. "We were trying to help you." "No," Margaret answered. "You were trying to prepare for ownership." "That's ridiculous." Vanessa stepped forward now, losing control completely. "We planned our entire life around that money." There it was. Raw. Ugly. Honest. Even Ethan looked shocked she said it aloud. But Vanessa couldn't stop anymore. The house, Chloe's school, the business networking, all of it depended on stability. Margaret stared at her. "Mine or yours?" Nobody answered. At that exact moment, another sound broke through the tension. A backpack slipping onto the hardwood floor near the entryway. Everyone turned. Chloe stood frozen beside the open front door. Her face pale. Eyes wide with fear. Nobody had even heard her come in. "Chloe," Ethan started immediately. But she interrupted him before he could recover. "I heard you." The room went still again. Vanessa's voice sharpened instantly. "Heard what?" Chloe's hands trembled visibly at her sides. "The night after Grandma's dinner," her breathing shook. "I heard you talking in the kitchen." Ethan moved forward carefully. "Sweetheart, this isn't, you said if you got control of Grandma's accounts." Chloe's voice cracked hard now. "You could eventually sell her house and move her somewhere smaller." Silence detonated through the room. Vanessa's face drained white. Ethan looked horrified. Not because it was false. Because it had been spoken aloud. Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet for one brief second. Sell her house. Move her somewhere smaller. Like she was already disappearing. Like her life had become a logistical inconvenience waiting to be managed. Chloe's backpack lay crooked on the floor beside her shaking legs while tears gathered in her eyes. "I didn't tell Grandma because I thought maybe I misunderstood." Margaret's chest tightened so violently it almost stole her breath. And suddenly everything connected. The joint account questions. The power of attorney consultation. The concern about simplifying finances. They were building toward something. Slowly. Patiently. And for the first time in her life, rage finally broke through Margaret's silence completely. "This is no longer about money." Her voice exploded through the house so loudly that even Ethan flinched. "This is about survival." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Margaret pointed toward both of them with shaking hands. "I am not some ATM machine born to finance your lives." The words tore out of her with decades of buried exhaustion behind them. Years of guilt. Years of manipulation. Years of disappearing quietly so everyone else could stay comfortable. Vanessa stepped backward first. Then Ethan. And standing in the center of the room, surrounded by silence, trembling hands, and shattered illusions, Margaret finally understood something terrifying. The people who claimed to love her had already started planning for the life they wanted after taking control of hers. The house stayed silent for hours after the confrontation. No calls. No pounding at the door. No furious messages lighting up Margaret's phone every few minutes. Just quiet. Heavy, unfamiliar quiet. By midnight, the neighborhood outside had faded into darkness. The only light inside the house came from the small lamp near the living room sofa where Margaret sat wrapped in a blanket she hadn't realized Chloe left behind weeks earlier. Her body felt drained. Not victorious. Not satisfied. Just tired. The kind of exhaustion that arrives after years of holding emotional weight too long. Then headlights swept slowly across the front windows. One car. Not two. Margaret looked toward the clock. 12:14 a.m. A few seconds later, there was a knock at the door. Soft this time. Careful. Nothing like before. Margaret didn't move immediately. She listened first. No Vanessa. No angry footsteps pacing outside. Only silence between knocks. When she finally opened the door, Ethan stood alone beneath the porch light. And for the first time in years, he looked young again. Not successful. Not polished. Just tired. His eyes were bloodshot. His tie was gone. One sleeve remained partially rolled up like he had forgotten halfway through doing it. Even his breathing sounded uneven. Neither of them spoke right away. Cold night air drifted quietly between them. Finally Ethan looked down. Vanessa took Chloe to her sister's house. Margaret nodded once. He swallowed hard before speaking again. She's scared of me. The sentence almost seemed to surprise him as he said it aloud. Margaret studied her son carefully. Not the businessman. Not the father. Just the frightened little boy she once held together after Charles died. I heard her crying tonight, Ethan admitted softly. She thought I didn't notice. His voice cracked slightly near the end. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan exhaled shakily and rubbed both hands over his face. I don't even know when everything got this bad. Margaret looked at him for a long time before answering. It didn't happen all at once. That hurt more. Because deep down, Ethan knew she was right. Years. It had taken years. Years of small compromises. Small dependencies. Small excuses repeated often enough to stop sounding dangerous. Ethan stepped inside slowly after Margaret moved aside. The house felt strangely fragile around them now, as if even the walls were exhausted from carrying tension. He sat heavily on the edge of the couch while Margaret remained standing nearby. Then finally, quietly, the truth came out. I leaned on you so hard, Ethan whispered, staring down at his shaking hands. I forgot you were breaking underneath me too. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. There it was. Not a defense. Not another excuse. Recognition. Real recognition. And somehow that felt more painful than the yelling had. Ethan looked up again, his voice rough with shame. I kept telling myself I was taking care of the family. You were, Margaret answered gently. Just not mine. The words hit him hard enough that he physically looked away. Silence settled again. But this silence felt different. Not hostile. Honest. After several minutes, Ethan spoke again without lifting his head. When Chloe looked at me tonight, his jaw tightened. She looked afraid. Margaret sat down slowly across from him. Because children know the difference between love and control long before adults admit it. Ethan nodded once. Small. Broken. Margaret studied him quietly before speaking again. Helping someone is not the same as being used. The sentence lingered heavily between them. No anger inside it. Only truth. Ethan's eyes filled instantly, though he fought hard not to let the tears fall. For the first time in years, Margaret saw something inside her son beginning to crack open beneath all the pride, entitlement, and performance. Not fixed. Not healed. But finally exposed. Outside, the street remained completely still beneath the dark California sky. And by the next morning, the silence inside Margaret's house would feel stranger than any chaos that came before it. The next morning arrived so quietly it almost felt unreal. Margaret woke just after sunrise and remained still for a few seconds, listening. No vibrating phone against the nightstand. No aggressive knocking. No emergency disguised as love. Only birds somewhere beyond the open bedroom window and the faint sound of traffic waking slowly beneath the California morning light. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt heavy. It felt safe. She wrapped a cardigan around her shoulders and walked barefoot into the kitchen while pale sunlight stretched gently across the hardwood floor. The window above the sink stood slightly open, letting cool ocean air drift through the house. Outside, the street looked peaceful again. Ordinary. A woman walked her dog past the driveway. Somewhere nearby, wind moved softly through palm trees. Margaret filled the kettle and waited while steam slowly rose toward the ceiling. No panic followed it. No demands. Just quiet. And after surviving emotional warfare for so long, quiet itself began to feel like healing. She carried her tea onto the small back patio and sat alone beneath the morning sun. The warmth touched her face gently while she watched light move across the garden stones Charles once placed there by hand decades ago. For a brief moment, she thought about calling him. Not because she felt broken. Because she finally understood something he used to say. Peace is expensive, Maggie. Most people spend their whole lives avoiding the price. Now she knew what he meant. The phone beside her remained silent until nearly noon. Then finally, one message appeared. Chloe. Margaret opened it slowly. I'm proud of you, Grandma. That single sentence hit differently than praise ever had before. Not admiration. Understanding. Margaret pressed the phone lightly against her chest while tears gathered quietly in her eyes. Across generations, something painful had finally stopped repeating itself. Because Chloe had witnessed everything. The manipulation. The silence. The control disguised as responsibility. And instead of learning to normalize it, she learned to recognize it. Another message followed a minute later. I think you taught me what respect is supposed to look like. Margaret covered her mouth briefly as emotion tightened her throat again. Not dramatic tears. Healing tears. The kind that arrive when suffering finally produces meaning instead of endurance. 3 days later, Ethan returned one final time. Daylight this time. No shouting. No demands. He stood at the front door holding nothing except his car keys and a face Margaret barely recognized anymore. Smaller somehow. Not weak. Honest. I got a second job, he admitted quietly after she let him inside. Margaret said nothing. I sold the Mercedes. A painful smile flickered briefly across his face. Turns out I should have done that years ago. No manipulation hid inside the sentence. No performance. Just accountability finally arriving after decades of delay. Ethan looked around the house slowly before speaking again. I kept thinking being a provider meant protecting appearances. His eyes lowered. But I was just protecting my own comfort. Margaret studied him carefully. And for the first time in a very long while, she saw the possibility of a man beginning to grow where entitlement used to live. Not redeemed. Not finished. But beginning. Then Ethan inhaled shakily. I'm sorry, Mom. No excuses followed. No requests for money. Only the apology itself. And somehow, that made it real. Margaret nodded once, her voice soft when she finally answered. Good. Nothing more was needed. Because healing does not always begin with forgiveness. Sometimes it begins with responsibility. That evening, Margaret sat alone beside the open kitchen window while sunset painted gold across the quiet street outside. Her tea had gone cold again. But this time, she smiled when she noticed. At 73 years old, she finally understood something nobody teaches women early enough. Boundaries do not destroy families. Exploitation does. And peace begins the day you stop apologizing for wanting to be treated with respect. The house remained still around her. No fear inside it anymore. No obligation. No emotional debt. Just a woman who had finally stopped shrinking herself to keep everyone else comfortable. Outside, the California sky darkened slowly into evening. Inside, for the first time in years, Margaret felt free. Some people only know how to love you while you are still sacrificing pieces of yourself for their comfort. The moment you stop bleeding for them, the warmth disappears, and suddenly you see the relationship clearly for the first time. But if love slowly begins stripping away your dignity, your peace, your voice, was it ever truly love at all? Maybe that is the hardest question this story leaves behind. And if someone in your life has ever treated your kindness like an unlimited resource instead of a human gift, I want you to tell me your story in the comments. Not because you are weak. Because silence is where this kind of pain survives the longest. And if stories about family betrayal, emotional manipulation, late awakenings, and painful truths hidden inside ordinary homes speak to you, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the most devastating truths are not waiting out in the world. They are sitting quietly at your own dinner table.